The blinds bled sunlight in hard stripes across the courtroom, cutting the dust into ribbons I could almost hear. The air conditioning hummed a calm lie. I stood at counsel table with the case file in my hands, and the cardboard edges bit the heels of my palms until I felt steadier than I was. The seal on the folder read, Re. Sergeant Jacob Hayes. Posthumous appeal. Under it, my father's name, Chief Judge Henry Whitman, sat in ink that never learned humility. I cleared my throat. The microphone caught the sound and split it into a low, woolly hiss that ran along the rail like static. Somewhere in the gallery, a shoe scuffed, a cough was strangled halfway, and a reporter's pen scratched paper as if speed could replace courage. The flag behind the bench hung heavy, no draft to flatter it. I could smell old varnish and hot dust from the lights, the twin scents of rooms where truth is supposed to have an audience. The daughter of the judge who condemned him, someone whispered. The words traveled like a rumor that had found its home. I didn't look back. I looked up, past the bench, past the crest, to the portrait that had presided over every verdict of my childhood. My father stared down in oil and authority. Square jaw, clipped silver hair, the hand that had held a gavel poised over a ledger you couldn't see. As a girl, I had traced that face with my eyes until I could draw it in the dark. As a woman, I felt it watching me like an order I hadn't decided whether to obey. Major Whitman, the clerk said, voice clipped, the end of my name cutting off like a rope. Are you ready to proceed? I set the case file on the table. The thud of board on wood was soft, precise. It sounded like the beginning of something that could no longer be delayed. Yes, I said. My mouth tasted like pennies. Ready. I lifted the file again, opened it to the first page, and found the line I had practiced saying without letting my hands shake. Let the record show. This time I'm here for the truth. A thread of surprise pulled the room tight. In the back row, a camera's shutter coughed. At the end of the aisle, a soldier in service blues straightened, his hand closing around a pair of dog tags until they clicked softly like a prayer trying not to be heard. Lieutenant Paul Hayes, the son, stood without standing, every line of him braced. The judge on the bench adjusted his glasses, eyes flicking to the portrait, then back to me. He didn't have to say it. I've spent my life reading men who didn't think they owed their voices to women. Choose your posture, the silence said. You can't choose your father. I will keep my opening brief, I said, because I had to speak before the room remembered more of him than of me. We are here because the judgment entered by this court 20 years ago was wrong in fact and in law. We are here because Sergeant Jacob Hayes died wearing a name that wasn't his. We are here because a judge signed a sentence he didn't believe. The last sentence hung in the air like a chandelier that had started to sway. A few heads turned toward the portrait as if paint could confess. The flag behind the bench did not move. Not yet. I felt the grain of the lectern under my fingertips, the lacquer slick where palms have worried it smooth. My father used to say, "You command a room first with your breath." I learned later that he meant withdraw it. I inhaled anyway. I let the breath fill me without apology. You knew him, didn't you? A reporter called softly from the first press row, forgetting himself because the quiet had made him human. The sergeant? I shook my head. I knew the file, I said, until I learned to know the man. The overhead lights buzzed, a high insectile whine that only arrives when metal warms too fast. The smell of dust lifted from the fixtures and turned the air into a thin loam of old decisions. I touched the gavel in my bag, the one my father had kept in his study and that I had brought today like a talisman or a weapon. I wasn't sure which. The wood felt cool through the canvas, its weight honest. Emblems help you carry sentences that otherwise collapse under their own gravity. When I was 12, he made me sit through a court-martial. The memory walked up my spine, now uninvited. The click of his shoes on tile, the sweep of his robe, his voice, clean, tempered, precise, as he told a man that procedure had more mercy than people. Emotion clouds the gavel, he had said to me that night over dinner. The fork and knife aligned perfectly on the plate's edge, the china clinking against wood with ceremonial restraint. Justice isn't mercy, Claire, it's control. I had nodded because nodding was safe. I learned the exits in that sentence years later. Now, under the flag's stillness, I heard a different sentence he had written to me in a hand that shook. Someday, fix what I couldn't. The ink bled a little, where it must have paused above the page, a small admission of a man not used to asking. The note had been dated a week before his heart quit holding him together. I carried its edge against my palm until it left a small, private welt. Counsel, the judge said, you may call your first witness. Not yet, Your Honor, I said. The words landed clean, no wobble. Before testimony, the record needs an error corrected. The Hayes confession, the cornerstone of this conviction, was coerced. The radio logs were forged, and the court's chief judge was pressured to deliver a verdict that protected an image instead of a truth. A murmur rose, low and cellular. I let it crest and fall. The human part of a courtroom is the only part that can absorb a revelation without breaking. And who? The judge asked, a trained neutrality in his tone. Do you allege applied that pressure? General Charles Morrison. I didn't look at the retired officer 3 rows back. I didn't need to. Power sheds heat even when it thinks it's sitting still. Then commander of the relevant theater, now a private citizen. He will be addressed here as a witness, not as a relic. A soft laugh rippled from the press bench and died when no one joined it. Morrison's attorney shifted a stack of folders by millimeters, papers whispering against papers in a dry panic. The clerk's pen paused. Objection? He asked the defense out of reflex. On what grounds? Morrison's man said, a fraction too quickly. Speculation, hearsay, family vendetta. The words looked good written down. They didn't hold up in the air. I could feel my heart beating where my collar met my throat. The ribbon on the flag moved a fraction then. Almost nothing, the suggestion of breeze finding an opening. I swallowed metal. I tasted the day my father had shown me his robe, the careful heft of it, as if fabric could learn to teach you how to carry a verdict. Your Honor, I said, this is not a vendetta. It's an audit. Behind me, Lieutenant Hayes stood as if pulled by a magnet. He didn't speak. He reached into his breast pocket and took out his father's dog tags. They lay flat in his palm, mute, edges dulled from years of being handled by a man who needed an object to remember who he'd been allowed to be. The chain made no sound when it slid. He lifted his hand toward the bench, not begging, not accusing, just raising a piece of metal into light that had ignored it for too long. The judge saw it. He adjusted his glasses again. The gesture betrayed the hand that wanted something to do besides hold a pen. Proceed, he said at last. The reporters leaned forward as one organism. Somewhere a chair complained. I opened the inner sleeve of the file and removed a slim, ugly thing. A mini cassette in a plastic case, labeled in my father's cramped hand, Hayes, Chambers. The tape ticked once when I turned it over, the little reels knocking against their cage like a bird testing wire. This was recorded privately, I said, each syllable careful as a foot on ice. Years after the sentencing, it was kept in Judge Whitman's study in a sealed folder stamped classified Hayes case. It is not offered as precedent. It is offered as confession. Morrison's lawyer half rose. Objection? They're not evidence, Your Honor, I said before he finished. They're confession. The judge's hand hovered over his bench like a gavel that hadn't decided what to do with gravity. He looked once quickly at the portrait. The painted eyes did what they had always done, demanded nothing of the living except similarity. He brought his hand down, not a bang, just a placement. Overruled, he said softly. Let the room hear what it has carried in silence. I slid the tape into the deck. The machine clicked. One clean sound, the kind that snaps nerves back into attention. The courtroom breathed in. The speaker crackled, found its line, and then my father's voice filled the room where he no longer had a seat. I killed a soldier with my pen, he said. No robe, no bench. Just a man telling the truth to a machine because humans had proven unreliable. Not my pistol, my pen. No one moved. Even the dust seemed to choose a place and hold it. The flag behind the bench lifted the smallest degree and fell. An invisible current filing its own amicus brief. I closed my eyes for an inhale. The wood of the lectern pressed into my fingertips, grounding me in a way the portrait never had. When I opened them, I found Paul Hayes in the crowd. He had tears standing in his eyes, but not falling. He raised his hand, straightened his spine, and gave a salute. Not to me, not to the judge, but to the bench itself, as if the wood had finally learned who it was for. My father can rest now, he said, voice low, steady. Morrison's man exhaled a single audible curse into the paper in front of him. The gallery didn't react. They were listening for the last echo of the sentence my father had just put into the air, and by doing so, into history. The judge leaned back. The leather creaked. He looked at the portrait again. I could not see his eyes from where I stood. I recognized the angle of a man deciding which definition of honor would follow him home. Counsel, he said, voice stripped of theater. Call your witness. I glanced at my bag. The gavel's round head pressed against the canvas like a heartbeat. I carried my father's tool into rooms he would never have entered this way. I carried it because objects matter. We teach them to hold what we can't in our hands. General Morrison, I said, and the name fit the room as if it had been measured for its edges. Please take the stand. The flag stirred again. The portrait did not. Somewhere above the ceiling tiles, a duct sighed, relieved to have work. And under the portrait's gaze, I felt the small, clear click inside, the one that meant the record had finally turned to the side that was meant to be played. I was my father's student. I became the law's servant. Today, I was both and neither. Today, I was what he asked me to be when he forgot how. I looked up at him, at paint that would never be corrected, and let my jaw set in a shape that was mine. Let the record show, I said again. We are not here to tidy a legacy. We are here to return a name to a uniform. The court reporter's keys cracked like rain on tin. The judge nodded once. Morrison stood, and the room, at last, remembered how to breathe. I grew up learning that justice had a smell: old wood polish, warm paper, a ghost of coffee in rooms that took the shape of my father's voice. He carried the law like a temperature. When he entered a courtroom, the air cooled a few degrees, and people sat up straighter without knowing why. At home, the flag hung above his study door. No draft, no flutter, watching us pass like a sentry that never blinked. He spoke in axioms. Justice isn't mercy, Claire, it's control. The sentence lived in our house the way a clock does. Constant, unargued, measuring you even when you pretended not to hear it. On Sunday nights, he'd lay a case file on the dining table with the same care other fathers used to set down board games. The paper edges rasped softly against linen. My mother refolded the corners like she could tuck the edges of the world back in. When I was 12, he took me to a court-martial, the way some fathers take a kid to their first ball game. The gallery benches were slick under my palms, varnish cool and unforgiving. The ceiling fluorescence hummed a high, insect sound that made my teeth ache. I watched a private stand alone inside a rectangle of light and answer questions with a voice that kept breaking like a wave hitting the wrong shore. When the verdict came, the judge's gavel snapped the room into a single idea. It sounded like finality pretending to be wisdom. I cried afterward, a quiet leak I tried to disguise as discipline. He handed me a folded handkerchief as if we were exchanging rank. Emotion clouds the gavel, he said not unkindly. Bring me your mind, not your flood. The cotton scratched my cheek. The lesson scratched deeper. He loved me by training me. I learned posture from his shadow, cadence from his footfalls, and faith from the way microphones surrendered to him. First a hiss, then obedience. When I said I wanted law school, he kissed the top of my head, and I felt his breath warm the part in my hair. Good, he said. Be the version of me that never blinks. In the academy courtroom, I sat where I knew he would sit and let the chilled air bite the back of my hands until the sting made me still. I wrote opinions for classes in his syntax without meaning to. I chased precision the way he had chased control, thinking they were cousins. The first time a professor said, "You argue like a Whitman," pride flashed through me like a siren. Later, I learned sirens are for emergencies, not for praise. At home, the study door had a habit of not closing all the way. Night made the lamp inside look like a small, contained sun. I would stand in the hall and listen to paper move, a dry whisper like leaves learning Latin. He spoke to himself in fragments. Find the record, anchor intent, narrow discretion. The gavel lay within reach, its wooden head polished to a warm glow. I used to touch it with one finger when he wasn't looking, the way you touch holy water without admitting belief. The wood felt cool, then warmer, the way a rule does once you've repeated it enough times for it to live in your mouth. People called him the conscience of the army courts. I saw the toll that title took in the way his shoulders set before every hearing, as if he were sliding under a yoke only he could lift. At banquets, microphones softened for him, and the room's murmur thinned like fog when a wind arrives. Afterward, strangers told me I was lucky to be raised by honor. I smiled and said, "Thank you. You can be grateful to a cathedral without wanting to sleep in it." The Hayes case didn't enter my vocabulary until much later, first as an absence in his stories, then as a smudge in a timeline. He never said the man's name, he just moved quickly past a month on the shelf like a finger avoiding a bruise. When I asked about the gaps, he fed me doctrine, command responsibility, exigent necessity, faith in the record. He always ended with some version of, "A judgment stands because it must." It was a winter night when the fracture showed. The heat had kicked on with a hollow thud. The vents laid a small, consistent warmth along the floorboards. I went looking for extra printer paper and opened the wrong drawer in the study. A sealed folder sat there with the bureaucrat's version of shouting stamped across it. Classified Hayes case. My name was on a small yellow note stuck to the tab. Claire, in his thin, fast hand. I should have closed the drawer. I didn't. I slid the folder out and the cardstock rasped like a warning. Inside, a trial transcript with redactions that looked like burns, a radio log that smelled faintly of damp storage, an unsigned memo on letterhead I recognized too well. At the back, a single page with my father's handwriting, not trying to be a judge. Innocent, underlined, then smaller, as if he didn't want the room to hear him. No courage left in me to fix it. The radiator clicked once. My heart did something similar. I eased the folder shut and slid it back like returning a borrowed heartbeat. In the hall, the flag above his door pinned the air in place. I stood under it and tried to recall every time he'd taught me to separate what I could prove from what I believed. The flag didn't move. My belief did. The next morning, he poured coffee with a hand that trembled just enough to make a sound on the cup's rim. He didn't mention the drawer. He talked about a different case, like we were both pretending the house wasn't holding that single word in every room. When I left for work, he put his hand on my shoulder, warm, heavy, and said, "Remember, the record is safer than regret." He died the day after. A neat phrase like heart failure tries to make peace with the violence a body does when it decides to leave. The house changed temperature. Papers kept their shape out of habit. The flag didn't learn how to look bereft. It only learned to be looked at that way. At the funeral, the chapel smelled like carnations and polish. Grief made respectable. The chaplain quoted from a book my father preferred because men inside it know who they are. After the hymn, a man in uniform approached me with the measured step of someone who had learned to move through rooms without starting fights he couldn't finish. Lieutenant Paul Hayes introduced himself without making me pay for the surname. His handshake was steady. The dog tags in his pocket clicked once when he shifted his weight. "My father didn't betray his unit," he said softly, like a person telling a name to a door. "Your father knew that." He handed me a small wooden box. The lid whispered when I slid it back. Inside rested my father's gavel and a second folder, the exact twin of the one in the study, down to the crease in the tab. On top, a note on my father's stationery, the watermark catching the chapel light and throwing it back in a thin rectangle across my fingers. "Claire, someday, fix what I couldn't." Dated 7 days before his heart fell out of the fight. The organ sighed. The congregation stood. I sat for one extra second. The weight of the gavel in my lap, something precise and undeniable. The wood was cool. The handle fit my palm like a tool passed down in a family where hands learn the shape of work before they understand its meaning. After, the estate emptied with the hush of shoes on carpet and the scrape of folding chairs being returned to closets. In his study, the air smelled like warmed paper and absence. I set the two folders side by side and felt the difference between a secret and a charge. The portrait over the mantel had followed me home. The brush strokes made him look younger than the note made him sound. I turned the frame to face the wall. The room became less theatrical the instant I did. Captain Laura Grant, my mentor, called from a hallway that still remembered him. Her voice carried through the receiver with the old courtroom's hollow acoustic. "If you open it," she said, "you can't set it down." "I know," I said. "And if you don't open it," she added, "you'll carry a different weight anyway." I flipped the latch on the folder. The metal made a small, decisive tick. Forged radio logs have a smell when you've read enough clean ones. The ink sits on the paper wrong, the toner leaves a faint dust-like gilt you can wipe with your thumb. The confession transcript read like a man trying to wear someone else's crime. The pauses were in the wrong places. Hayes's signature trembled exactly where fear would have lived. Not the fear of what he'd done, but the fear of what had been done to him. At the bottom, a memo from General Charles Morrison. Language so crisp it cut maintain institutional integrity. Expedite conclusion. Avoid collateral to reputation. My father had initialed it. Next to his initials, a dot of ink where the pen had hesitated. Down the hall, the HVAC kicked on. The vent breathed a ribbon of air across the flag and made it stir. Barely, but enough to prove the room wasn't entirely closed. I set the gavel on the desk beside the open file. The wood met wood with a soft, honest knock. I told myself I'd sleep on it. I didn't. I lay there listening to the house remember how to settle without him. The old pipes pinging like typewriter keys. Footsteps that didn't happen because there was no one left to pace. I brought the folder to my chest like a book you don't finish because you're afraid of the last page. When I finally slept, I dreamed in stripes of light like the blinds in the courtroom, and the sound in my dream was the soft thud of a gavel I had not yet learned how to use. In the morning, I carried the gavel and the file into the kitchen. The table's surface was cool under my wrists. Sunlight pushed through the window and laid a clean rectangle across the word innocent until the ink shone like a bruise admitting itself. I thought of every sentence my father had used to hold me still. I thought of the one he'd left me to move. I buttoned my uniform, felt the cloth scratch across my forearm as if to remind me I was built to do work, not watch it pass. I slipped the note into my breast pocket. The paper's edge pressed lightly against my skin with every breath. I left the study door open. The flag watched me go. Or maybe, finally, I watched it. The morning my father died, the house sounded wrong. No low murmur from the study, no ceramic clink of his cup setting down on a saucer in the precise middle of a coaster. The refrigerator's soft motor hummed too loud, like an understudy trying to play a lead. I stood in the doorway to his room and watched sunlight square itself on the coverlet. The sheet still held the ghosted shape of his shoulder. The air smelled faintly of aftershave and paper, clean, determined, unfinished. At the hospital, a monitor went flat with an almost apologetic tone, and then fell quiet. The nurse's hand touched my forearm. Cool, brief. I'm sorry," she said. I nodded because the only motion available to me was vertical. In the elevator down, the fluorescent lights buzzed in their sockets, and the handrail was so cold it made my palm ache. Grief hadn't found its voice yet. Discipline was filling in. We buried him on a Friday. The chapel held the kind of silence people rent for an hour and pretend is theirs. Organ pipes sighed. The flag on his casket looked heavier than cloth has any right to be. When the honor guard folded it, the fabric whispered a measured shh with each turn. A library teaching the room how to behave. A chaplain read from a passage my father liked because no one in it hesitates. The wood of the pew under my fingers felt waxed to a hardness that refused to take fingerprints. After the hymn, a man in uniform approached with a step that was careful but unafraid. He was my age, maybe younger. Jaw tight, cap tucked under his arm. The dog tags in his pocket clicked once when he stopped, a small sound that somehow filled the aisle. "Major Whitman," he said. "I'm Lieutenant Paul Hayes." The name found a place inside me it had been circling for days. "Thank you for coming," I managed. My father didn't betray his unit. He didn't push the words, he set them down between us like evidence. His voice carried a thin rasp, as if it had learned to speak around a stone. "Your father knew that." He lifted a small wooden box with both hands and offered it the way you hand a person their own photograph, gently, aware of the danger of recognition. The lid slid back with a soft rasp. Inside lay my father's gavel, warm wood gone cold, nested against a second folder, twin to the one in his study, classified Hayes case. On top, a single sheet of stationery. I knew the watermark before I unfolded it. Claire, someday, fix what I couldn't. The date at the bottom was 7 days old. The ink had bled where his pen must have paused. I felt the paper's edge bite my thumb. A sting. A fact. How did you? I began. He gave it to Captain Laura Grant years back, Paul said. Insurance. She passed it to me when he got sick. Said to wait for the day you'd be the one to open it. He swallowed, eyes not leaving mine. I almost didn't. I didn't want to make a daughter choose between her father and her father. I let out a breath that sounded like it had been holding a wall up. You didn't make me choose, I said. He did. And then he asked me to choose differently. Paul's shoulders dropped half an inch, the first retreat from brace I'd seen. He lifted his hand, not to shake, not to salute, simply to touch the lid of the box like you might touch the shoulder of someone who has finally arrived. The knuckle of his forefinger brushed the gavel's head. Wood tapped wood, a small true note. My father used to say the only verdict that matters is the one the dead can live with, he said. I don't know if that's poetry or nonsense, but I promised him I'd find out. I will, I said. The promise stood up inside me like a person. I'll put his name back in the uniform. Outside the chapel, the wind lifted and dropped the trees in front of the windows. The branches made a quiet finger drumming against the glass. I closed the lid and felt the box weight translate itself along my arms, from wrists to elbows to the hinges of my shoulders. Emblems travel like that. Once you accept them, they find your joints. At the reception, people said the right things, in voices that sounded like they'd been ironed. A giant. A conscience. A loss to the courts. My mother moved among them with a tray and the expression of a woman making order out of a storm because chaos stains tablecloths. Captain Laura Grant found me by the coffee urn, where the smell of burnt beans pretended to be comfort. Her fingers brushed my sleeve, a touch quick and exact as punctuation. You saw it? She asked. I did. She glanced toward the portrait on the Fellowship Hall wall. My father fixed in parody of breath, bronze plaque under his name, reflecting light in a tone the living could never match. He wanted to fix it, she said. He ran out of courage or time. Both are forms of poverty. He left me a note. Laura's mouth softened. Then he finally gave you something more useful than a lecture. Back at the house, I set the box on the kitchen table and lifted the gavel free. The grain ran straight. The handle fit my palm as if my hand had learned it in another life. I struck it once against the table. The sound was not a bang. The sound? It was a thock that sat in the wood and stayed there the way some truths do. I opened the folder. The paper edges rasped under my fingertips like pages in a pew Bible. Inside, the trial transcript with seams where the language had been pushed to make room for a lie. A photocopied radio log with timestamps that didn't like each other. An affidavit unsigned and missing a witness who had disappeared into the polite fog of reassignment. At the back, a single-page memo from General Charles Morrison. Maintain institutional integrity. Expedite conclusion. Avoid collateral to reputation. My father's initials scrawled in the margin. Beside them, a dot of ink where the pen had stuttered, conscience's hiccup. The heating kicked on with its hollow thud, and a ribbon of warm air slid under the flag in the study doorway and made it stir. I took that as permission. I set the gavel down on the open page and let its weight hold the past in place while I made a next. At midnight, the house settled into the old bones of its quiet. The floorboards exhaled. The portrait above the mantel watched the room, but not me. I had turned it to face the wall again because I needed the absence more than the gaze. I dialed the one number that lives in a prosecutor's hand before it knows its own phone, the Office of Records. Whitman, the operator said. My name sounded different on her tongue, balanced on a fulcrum it hadn't had the day before. What do you need? An appointment with the archive, I said. My voice didn't shake. The gavel's head was cool under my palm, the line of the handle pressed into the meat of my thumb. And a petition template for posthumous exoneration. There was a beat of silence, and I could hear the low whir of her computer, the tiny white noise that says, machines are doing what humans ask them to. For which case, sir? She asked. Hayes, I said. Jacob. I hung up and looked at my father's note again. The paper had a small crease where I'd folded it and unfolded it too many times in one day. I ran my thumb along the ridge until it flattened. Someday, fix what I couldn't. It was the closest thing to an apology he had ever given me. I put it in my uniform's breast pocket and felt it rest against my skin, an edge I could carry without bleeding. Before bed, I walked into the study and stood under the flag. The cloth's hem brushed my knuckles with a dry whisper, as if it had started teaching me a new word. I lifted the gavel, felt its weight settle, and set it back down with care. The house listened. The silence didn't accuse. It waited. By morning, the sun came in clean bars and laid one across the word innocent until the letters seemed to breathe. I tucked the folder under my arm. The cardboard scraped my sleeve, the sound of paper agreeing to be proof. I left the door open when I went out. The portrait faced the wall. The flag moved once in the wake of my body and then hung still. The record had been my father's catechism. Now it was my road. The Pentagon archive breathed cold even at noon, the kind of chill that sharpened paper edges into knives. Fluorescence hummed overhead, a thin electric whine that made the space between my molars ache. I signed the log, slid on cotton gloves that smelled faintly of starch, and pulled the Hayes cartons one by one. The cardboard rasped like a throat clearing after years of not being allowed to speak. Radio logs first. I lined the sheets along the table's seam and watched the timestamps like a cardiologist reads a bad EKG. There, 4-minute gap, bridged by a line in a different toner density, letters shaved on their left edges where a tired drum had dragged. Another page bore a ghost impression of a prior print. Backwards numerals, faint in the margin, the way a lie leaves its own watermark. I photographed each segment with a little handheld that clicked like a patient metronome. Next, confession transcript. The cadence was wrong. Answers came too quickly after compound questions, like a man running downhill because someone had pushed him. I traced the pauses with a pencil, marking every place a defense counsel should have objected and didn't. At the back, an addendum. Defendant requests counsel present before further statement. The following page began without one. Find me the missing deposition, I told records. The sergeant behind the glass squinted at the screen and shook his head. No such entry, he said. He slid a photocopy across with 2 fingers. The paper was warm from the machine. Chain jumps from received to filed. No witness list. Who pulled this box last? He glanced at the log. General Counsel, 19 years ago, initials CM. Charles Morrison. I pulled the gloves off and let my hands warm on the edge of the table. The laminate was nicked, a scarred surface meant to be indifferent. I pressed my palm flat anyway, felt the lines in it. From gavel handle, from file edges, stropped themselves back into usefulness. Back at my office, the flag over the door hung dead still. The air smelled like old coffee and copier ozone. I spread the photos across the desk, the black toner leaving the tips of my fingers dusted, as if I'd handled charcoal instead of policy. Captain Laura Grant closed the door with her heel, eyes already scanning the mess. Well? Forged logs, coerced confession, a deposition that walked off wearing a colonel's badge. I tapped the memo copy from Morrison, the language so scrubbed you could eat off it. Maintain institutional integrity. Expedite conclusion. Avoid collateral to reputation. Laura's mouth tightened. You're about to kick a monument. He asked me to, I said, and laid my father's note in the center. Someday, fix what I couldn't. The ink had bled at the curve of the S. That flaw steadied me more than any rulebook I'd ever memorized. She leaned her hip against the desk. Unofficially, I'll walk you to the line. Officially, I'll pretend I don't know your shoes are over it. I pulled the petition template toward me. The paper's weight felt heavier than its GSM, as if it had agreed to carry more than words. Posthumous exoneration, I said. Each letter inked like a rung on a ladder I could climb out with. The division chief called me into his office before I could fine-tooth the last paragraph. His blinds sliced daylight into obedient bars. He kept 2 flags in the corner, national and branch, their poles clean enough to reflect your face if you got too close. He gestured to the chair. The leather creaked as I sat. the sound of a thing thinner than it looked. "You're filing on Hayes," he said. Not a question. "Yes, sir." He tapped a folder, the copy someone had already slid under his door. "You'll destroy your family's name." I rested my palms on my knees, felt the heat build under the fabric. "Then I'll build it on something real." He let the silence do a full lap. "You're accusing Morrison. You understand what that costs?" "Less than it cost Hayes." The words came out calm. I hadn't planned them. They'd been waiting behind my teeth for days. He stared another beat, then exhaled through his nose. "You will not speak to the press. You will route everything through me, and you will remember I did, at some point once like you." Outside his office, the corridor smelled faintly of floor wax and withheld approval. I carried the file under my arm like a shield. The edges bit the crook of my elbow. It helped. Paul Hayes met me at the base cafeteria, where the clatter of trays and the warm grease fug of fries made the world briefly, blessedly ordinary. He slid into the booth across from me, hands around a cup he wasn't drinking. "How bad?" he asked. "Bad enough to make men embarrassed of their uniforms," I said. "Good enough to fix." He nodded, eyes fixed on the dog tags peeking from his pocket. "He used to wear them when he mowed the lawn," he said, choking on the smallness of the memory. "Said they made his back straighter." "I'm filing today," I said. He let out a breath that had the shape of a word and decided at the last second to be air instead. "Do you need me there?" "I need you at the hearing," I said. "I need you to stand when the tape plays." We left through different doors. It felt correct. Two lines that would meet where the room needed them. By late afternoon, the petition sat complete. The metal edge of the hole punch clacked through the stack, clean round bites, and the brads slid in with a satisfying little drag. I carried the packet to filing. The clerk stamped the cover, a hard, wet thunk that left an embossed circle where we hope the world will pay attention. My hands shook afterward, and I let them. The tremor ran out into my fingertips and left me steadier. That evening, I drove past Morrison's gated development. The guardhouse glass reflected the sky's last color like a smug mirror. Through the bars, his house sat in deliberate, tasteful shadow. I rolled the window down. The air smelled like wet grass and new money. I didn't stop. I didn't need to look at him to know what he'd do. Cowards at that altitude are predictable. They hire men with smooth spines and smoother folders. My inbox confirmed it by morning. A demand letter as neat as a threat can be. Its serif font trying to make power look like decorum. Cease pursuit of defamatory allegations. Consider the reputational harm to the institution. I printed it and pressed a coffee ring into its lower corner with my mug. When I stacked it under the forged log photos, the ring bled slowly into the white, a stain doing what time would do anyway. Laura dropped a thumb drive on my desk. "Anonymous source," she said, "says the Hayes deposition was pulled into a general's bundle for pre-brief the night before sentencing. Not returned." She touched the gavel where it lay on the blotter. One quick press, the pad of her finger finding the wood's old warmth. "You have enough." I spent the day rehearsing how to ask to admit what wouldn't technically be admissible. My father's minis. His note. His confinement with a truth he had finally recorded for a machine because he didn't trust a man. I could hear the judge now. "Counselor." I practiced the answer until it fit in my mouth without catching. "They're not evidence, Your Honor. They're confession." At dusk, I walked the empty courtroom. Sunlight through the high windows laid bars across the pews like a memory of prison. The flag hung its tired weight behind the bench, colors dulled by years of filtered light and air that had learned too many secrets. I took the gavel from my bag and set it on counsel table. The wood met wood with a soft, resonant thock. It sounded less like punishment than punctuation. My phone buzzed. "Laura, docket posted. Tomorrow, 0900, internal broadcast." She added, "Breathe, short words, correct ones." I closed my eyes and let the room's sounds sort themselves. The HVAC's steady breath, the faint tick of the exit sign's failing tube, the soft complaint of the lectern when the building settled. Places have spines. You can feel when they're bracing for the truth. On my way out, I paused under the portrait in the hallway, the one the clerks always touched on exam days, habit pretending to be blessing. I didn't touch it. I looked at his eyes and felt, for the first time, neither the gravity that had held me nor the helium that had tried to float me into his shape. Just paint. Just a man. In the vestibule, the flag caught a draft from the closing door and lifted, the hem whispering along my knuckles. I whispered back without meaning to. Tomorrow. The guard at the exit scanned my badge. The scanner beeped twice, compliant, bored. Big day? He asked, because small talk is sometimes how strangers hold you together. Yes, I said. Bigger than it should have been. Outside, the night smelled like rain and hot asphalt. Storm coming, heat leaving. I carried the gavel in my bag and the note against my heart. The two weights balanced. In the rear view, the courthouse windows squared the dark into obedient shapes. Back home, I laid the uniform on the chair and the file on the table. I pressed my palm to the folder until the cardboard warmed, as if consent ran on temperature. The dog tags Paul had lent me for the hearing lay beside the gavel, chain pooled like a little river of proof. I stood at the window and watched lightning mutter somewhere beyond the river, a white seam unpicking the sky with patience. This is how storms introduce themselves. Not with noise, but with light showing you the edges you've pretended not to see. I turned off the lamp. I turned off the... In the dark, I could hear the flag outside my building lift and fall, like a breath learning a better rhythm. The petition waited by the door. The tape waited in its case. The courtroom waited with its particular hunger. And I slept. Brief, clean, because the choice was made, and all that remained was to walk into the room where my father had taught me to stand, and stand differently. The appellate courtroom carried the same cold I'd learned to call order. Fluorescents hummed. The varnished rail gave back a faint chemical smell like old polish waking. The internal broadcast lamp at the rear clicked on. White, unsentimental. Its heat finding the back of my neck and holding there like a hand that didn't believe in comfort. Case number 04731, United States versus Hayes. Posthumous appeal. The clerk intoned. Keys rattled like hail on a tin roof. I set the file down. The cardboard's edge bit my palm and steadied me. Morrison's counsel stood before I did. Smooth voice, crisp cuff. Your Honors, we move to limit scope. Counsel intends to introduce materials outside the trial record. I stepped to the lectern. The wood was cool and lacquer slick under my fingertips. They're not evidence, Your Honor, I said, voice even. They're confession. A slow turn of heads in the gallery. Officers, staff, the few civilians the broadcast had granted seats. At the back, Lieutenant Paul Hayes sat ramrod straight, thumb on his father's tags, the faint click of chain a metronome only I could hear. The presiding judge, Colonel Verma, adjusted her glasses. Proceed narrowly, Major, I nodded. First, the paper we can concede without shame. I slid the forged radio logs onto the document camera. The monitor bloomed with numbers. Note the 4-minute gap bridged by a line in a different tone or density. Note the backward numerals here, ghosted from a prior print. Note the missing witness list. The camera fan whispered, a small mechanical breath against the larger human one that had begun to hitch. Morrison's lawyer tapped his pen. Speculation. I kept my eyes on the bench. Second, the confession. The cadence is wrong. Requests for counsel ignored. Answers prompted by compound questions within 2 seconds. I let the math hang. The room knew what time meant. Your third point, Verma asked. The note, I said. I palmed the page that had lived against my heart for weeks and set a facsimile on the screen instead. My father's hand, unjudicial at last. Innocent. Underlined. Beneath it, smaller. No courage left in me to fix it. I let the silence find its landing. Then I turned the page and laid the second image beside it. Docket stamp, sentencing date, 1 week before. The underlined word bore a later date. I felt Morrison tense 2 tables down. Heat travels sideways when a man realizes the room knows the sequence he hoped it wouldn't. His jaw worked. He leaned to his counsel. I caught the whisper, kill it quietly. Verma's brows rose a millimeter. Counsel? I swallowed. My mouth tasted like metal. The word was written after sentencing, I said. He had begun the memorandum to overturn. He was blocked. How do you know he was blocked? Morrison's lawyer snapped. 8 words, sharp enough to cut. Because there's a missing line, I said, and put the memo from Morrison on the screen. The font looked innocent. The intent did not. Maintain institutional integrity. Expedite conclusion. Avoid collateral to reputation. At the bottom, my father's initials, the ink hesitating, an honesty he hadn't yet learned to suppress even in his pen. A low ripple moved through the gallery like tall grass catching wind. On the back wall, the broadcast tally light held steady. Somewhere behind it, a camera cooled its own nerves with a hum. Morrison stood. He didn't ask permission. Men like him don't remember they need it. You endanger the court, he said. 4 words, cut clean. No, I said, keeping my hands open on the lectern. I protect it. He took 1 step into the aisle. The bailiff's hand hovered, not touching, just claiming air. Morrison stopped. His lawyer tugged his sleeve, a puppeteer remembering the strings. Major? Verma said. Voice a balm kept cold. You said confession. I lifted the mini cassette, the ugly little thing that had kept its secret for years, and fitted it into the player. The deck clicked. The speaker coughed once, then found the line. My father's voice entered the room where he no longer had rank. Not the bench tone. The man. I killed a soldier with my pen, he said. Not my pistol. The words didn't echo, they settled. Even the fluorescent wine seemed to pull back and listen. Morrison's counsel half rose. Objection. Overruled, Verma said, too softly to be theater. We'll hear him. On the back bench, Paul's shoulders lifted and squared. He stood. The dog tags slid from his hand and lay flat against his palm. He raised them like a standard. My father can rest now, he said, voice clean, no tremor. 2 rows up, an old sergeant let out a breath that had been living in him for 2 decades. Somewhere, a chair creaked as someone leaned forward to see if a room could, in fact, become a witness. I turned to Morrison. General, did you direct the court to expedite? I kept my sentences short, specific, the way laundered truth hates. He smiled without showing teeth. Protect the uniform. From what? I asked. Doubt. Or accountability, I said. His face didn't move. His knuckles did, whitening against the table's edge. I held up the deposition Laura's anonymous source had delivered, scanned, time-stamped the missing witness statement. Sergeant Elena Ruiz testified Hayes refused the falsified log and asked for counsel. Where did this go? Morrison's lawyer. Irrelevant. Found in a general's bundle. Not returned, I said. Relevant. Verma looked from the screen to me to the portrait of a different chief judge on the wall who had never had to confess to a machine. Major Whitman, she said, anything further? I reached into my bag and drew out the gavel. Wood on palm, old warmth under skin. I did not raise it. I set it gently on the lectern, the head toward the bench. Only this, I said. My father signed his name on a lie. Today I signed mine on the truth. I felt the line leave me and seat in the room like a beam. Morrison's counsel opened his mouth. Nothing came. The broadcast lamp hummed louder for a second, then settled. Verma's gaze flicked to the flag behind her. The cloth lay heavy, no breeze to flatter it. The bench will recess for deliberation, she said, and tapped once her own gavel. The sound traveled clean through wood and bone. No one moved. For 3 heartbeats, the room remained a held breath. Then from the back, a single clap, soft, careful, oft. Another answered. Not applause. A counting, slow, a slow clap, building not to celebration but to understanding. The sound gathered bodies to their feet. Officers rose, civilians rose. The clerk stood, then bowed his head as if embarrassed by his own knees. The clap faded as height took over. A stand, quiet, resolute, the collective geometry of people agreeing to hold something upright. Paul brought his hand to his brow, soldier clean. Salute. Tears made his lashes bright but did not fall. He lowered his hand and pressed the tags to his chest until the chain left small half-moons in his skin. I didn't look at the portrait. I looked at the gavel between me and the bench. The distance measured now in inches. not an inheritance. The air smelled like warm varnish and a little like rain, though the windows were shut. When Verma returned, the room stilled without being asked. She didn't preface. The tribunal clears Sergeant Jacob Hayes of all charges, posthumously and unanimously, she said. This court refers the matter of command interference to the Inspector General and recommends immediate review of General Morrison's honors. Morrison didn't speak. He didn't need to. The absence of words was the first true thing he'd offered the uniform. I exhaled. It made no sound. I had been saving that breath for 20 years without knowing it. I touched the gavel with 2 fingers, the way you touch a stone in a river for balance, and then let my hand fall. The broadcast lamp cooled, its fan winding down to a whisper that sounded almost like relief. The flag didn't move. It didn't have to. The room had. The hallway outside the courtroom smelled like floor wax and cameras, ozone and nerves. The broadcast lamp by the door clicked down to a faint, tired hum. When the doors swung open, the corridor filled with the soft thunder of shoes on marble. That reverent hush people make when they've just watched a room change shape. Reporters fanned in, badges flashing, microphones shouldered like harmless weapons. Their questions came fast, overlapping, a paper storm. Major Whitman, was this justice or redemption? Do you have a statement for the Hayes family? Does this overturn your father's legacy? I held the file tight against my ribs until the cardboard warmed. The gavel in my bag knocked once against the clasp. Wood on metal, a small heartbeat. I let the first wave pass. The air conditioning breathed a ribbon of cool across my collarbone and steadied my voice. Both, I said, looking past the lenses to Paul Spencer Hayes, the man holding his father's name with both hands. For him and for me. The clicks slowed. Pens paused. Someone lowered their camera. Glass sighed back into its housing. Across the way, a staffer rolled a cart past with 2 portraits leaned face in, the frames wrapped in dusty velvet. The smaller placard balanced on top read, General Charles Morrison, Ret. A custodian peeled the double-sided tape from the Hall of Command wall with a soft, stubborn tearing sound that made 3 officers look away. In the courtyard, sun found the flag in a way it hadn't indoors. The cloth lifted and fell, breath made visible. Paul walked to the rail, pressed his father's tags flat against his chest, and let the chain mark moons above his heart. He's lighter, he said, voice roughened to rope. I can feel it. He's home, I answered. My phone buzzed. Laura. I stepped to the granite ledge where the stone still held the morning's cool. IG opened a file, she said without preface. And HQ pulled Morrison's portrait. Honors under review. They want your written summary by 1700. Send me the form, I said. A breeze nosed the pages in my arms. The petition's embossed seal scraped lightly against the gavel handle through the canvas. I liked the friction. It felt like the world finally catching. By late afternoon, the headlines stacked themselves with that rubber belt thunk across a dozen mounted screens in the lobby. The trial that took 20 years. Hayes cleared. Morrison referred. Strangers watched in that polite public way, hand on hip, weight on one leg, nodding once as if they could press their assent into glass. A child in a stroller reached toward the screen and batted at the crawling text with gum-sticky fingers. His mother smiled apologetically. He likes letters, she said. So did my father, I told her. He just forgot where they were supposed to go. At sunset, I crossed the base to the Hall of Command. Echoing, domed, the lobby light going amber. A cart lingered by a blank rectangle where Morrison had hung. The adhesive ghost on the wall held dust in the shape of power. A maintenance tech sprayed and wiped. The cloth squeaked as clean met clean. On the far wall, new brass letters had been screwed in above a narrow plinth. Posthumous exoneration, SGT Jacob Hayes. Beneath it, an empty space waited for something that did not yet exist. Paul stood beside it with a shadow full of history at his feet. What goes there? He asked, not taking his eyes off the gap. His name, I said, properly. We walked the length of the gallery in the hush that museums teach. Air vents breathed soft and slow. Our footsteps found a joint rhythm. At the exit, I touched the gavel through the bag and felt its round head press back. Solid, unshaken. My father had used it to finish sentences. I was learning to use it to open them. Outside, the evening smelled like cut grass and hot brick. Reporters had thinned to a few silhouettes, their cameras down, their hands in pockets. One called again, a little gentler, the day's edge sanded off. Major Whitman, any last word? I thought of all the polished answers a person can borrow, then I didn't. Names are uniforms, I said. We wear the ones we deserve. In the parking lot, Laura leaned against my car like a comma at the end of a paragraph that wasn't finished. They're asking about a presser tomorrow, she said. You don't owe them anything. I owe him placement, I said. Arlington, then the record. She smiled with half her mouth, the other half still carrying the day. Then take the morning. Bring the gavel. At home, I laid the file and the gavel on the table and turned off every light but the one over the sink. The room settled into a softer geometry. I read the tribunal's order again, following the lines with my fingertip as if tracing a scar. The paper had a smell, ink and machine heat, that reminded me of my father's study when the radiator first woke in November. In the quiet, I heard the flag outside my building lift and fall. It made a dry, honest sound, like cloth teaching air how to keep time. I set my father's note beside the order. Someday, fix what I couldn't. The crease down its center had finally decided which way it wanted to lie. I slept the way you do when someone else is finally holding the heavy end of the table. Brief, deep. Dawn would put me at Arlington. 2 stones. One name restored. One name redeemed by the thing a man left unwritten and asked his daughter to write. Mercy, at last, felt like a verdict I could carry without ceremony. Arlington breathed a thin winter hush. Frost silvered the grass, and the morning light came in clean, knife-bright bands between the rows. My boots made a soft, regular crunch along the gravel, a metronome set to Mercy. The air smelled like wet stone and pine. It found the back of my throat and held. I carried the gavel in one hand and the tribunal's order in the other. Paper rasped softly against my glove. Wood stayed cool, steady. At the crest of the hill, 2 stones waited. One with his name newly corrected, Sergeant Jacob Hayes. One with mine by inheritance, Judge Henry Whitman. The flag above the field lifted once and fell, cloth brushing wind with a dry whisper that sounded like pages finally turning. I set the order at the base of Hayes's stone and smoothed it flat. The seal caught the pale sun and flashed, then dulled. Paul stepped up beside me, breath showing in short, respectful clouds. He drew his father's tags from his pocket and let them pool against the granite. Metal on stone. A small, certain sound. He got it back, he said. No flourish. Just the sentence a son can live inside. He did, I answered. The words felt warm, leaving my mouth despite the air. I knelt and placed the gavel between the 2 graves. Its head toward Hayes, its handle toward my father. The cold bit through my knee, the sting felt right. I pressed my palm to the wood and felt the grain say its old, quiet piece. My father had used this tool to close futures. I was using it to open one that should never have been shut. You taught me to serve the law, I said to the stone that bore his name. The wind took my breath and thinned it, but the line stayed. I turned to Hayes's. I learned to serve the truth. A bugler rehearsed somewhere down the slope. 2 tentative notes, then the clear line that always finds your ribs. Paul lifted his hand in a crisp salute. He held it until the air felt finished with us, then let it fall and rest on the tags, thumb rubbing the stamped letters like a man reacquainting himself with a face. We stood without speaking. Frost melted from the grass tips as the sun climbed, glittering briefly and then surrendering to day. I thought of the rooms that had taught me posture and silence. I thought of the moment the tape hissed and my father laid his first honest words where rank couldn't tidy them. I thought of Morrison's portrait unhooked, the adhesive ghost left behind, the wall learning a new vocabulary. Thank you, Paul said, voice lowered as if we were guests. You carried the proof longer, I said. You did the hard part. He shook his head. You picked it up when it got heavy. When he left, his boots made the same measured crunch in reverse, metronome completing its bar. I stayed. Cold soaked my ankles. The world shrank to breath, stone, cloth, light. I slid my father's note from my pocket, creased and softened by weeks against my heart. Someday, fix what I couldn't. I tucked it under the gavel's handle, paper edge catching against wood, the two emblems crossing like a benediction I could finally accept. On the walk back down, the flag above the gate snapped once. Brighter now, wind up. The sound startled a pair of starlings from the hedges. They lifted as one and cut the air clean. I smiled, small, unperformed, the kind of smile meant for no camera. The Capitol came into view over the river as I drove in. The dome wore the same pale light as the stones, unromantic and honest. At the office, I filed the written summary. The clerk's stamp answered with a damp, declarative thunk. I sent a copy to Laura and one to records. When the confirmation ping arrived, two polite notes from a machine, I closed my eyes and listened to the quiet that followed. Not absence, completion. The Hall of Command had a new frame waiting that afternoon, a simple black bar in a clean rectangle of wall. The brass plate beneath it read, Jacob Hayes, cleared. I signed the placement form with my name and today's date. The pen's nib scratched the paper softly, a sound like skating on new ice. A young private lingered at the threshold, cap in hand, doubt and awe and a dozen questions crowding his face. Ma'am, years, he said. What do we do when the people we salute get it wrong? We move the light, I said. Then we salute the truth. He nodded, relieved to have instructions no manual would print. At dusk, I walked past the empty courtroom. The blinds made the same high-contrast stripes they'd made the day I stood under my father's portrait and said I was here for the truth. Dust hung in the light like a soft, benevolent fog. I set my hand on the rail and felt its varnish give back a little heat. The room remained itself, stern, squared, but the air in it had changed temperature by a degree only those who live inside it can feel. Outside, the flag over the entrance lifted and fell in the evening breeze, a breath sinking to the city's slow pulse. I stopped at the steps and looked up into that moving cloth. No longer a curtain to hide behind, not a shroud, just a standard doing its work. The microphones were put away. The gavel would sleep in a drawer. The order would sit where records sit, quiet, available, unashamed. I didn't destroy his legacy, I said, letting the line go where it had wanted to go since the tape clicked into place. I freed it from the lie. Streetlights came on. A bus sighed past. The day let me go without asking for more performance. That night, at my kitchen table, I placed the gavel beside the filed order and the returned dog tags. 3 weights, 3 temperatures. The window let in a faint wash of city light. It traced the wood's grain and the paper's decal and made the steel wink once and rest. I switched off the lamp. The room settled with the old apartment creaks I'd learned to trust. Radiator ticks, elevator cords whispering, someone upstairs setting a glass down with care. I slept easily. In the morning, I would teach the interns how to read a log without flinching and how to hear a confession without mistaking it for weakness. I would take the gavel to the classroom and let them feel its weight, not as threat, but as measure. Some legacies end in medals. Mine ended in mercy. Mercy is the final verdict.